One man took to the skies with a single Spitfire against a gale of 30 German fighters. One solitary pilot stood between a shattered RAF formation and wholesale destruction. The odds said he would not survive the hour, yet he broke into the storm of tracers, gunsmoke, and fire. And he refused to leave. The date was August 18th, 1940. A defining moment in the Battle of Britain, the aerial contest that held the fate of Britain in the balance. The Luftwaffe, relentless and ruthless, swarmed the skies above southern England, seeking to cripple the Royal Air Force and pave the way for a planned invasion. Fighter commands scrambled to meet the invasion fleet's advance. Every squadron was stretched thin, every pilot pushed to exhaustion. Spitfires and Hurricanes clashed in furious dogfights, trading bursts of machine gun fire at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, amid the jagged patchwork of clouds and sunlit heavens. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Should these German formations break RAF defenses, air supremacy would tilt against the British Isles, altering the course of the war. Yet amidst these desperate skies, in the fragile cockpit of a single-seat Spitfire Mark I, a young pilot prepared to confront not only the enemy, but the crushing weight of near impossible odds. This was no ordinary sortie. This was a test of skill, courage, and sheer willpower, where lives hung on every maneuver, every decision. The pilot's name was John Michael Mick Manock, a man whose journey to this moment was as harrowing as the battle itself. His story is one of resilience, brilliance, and an undying commitment to duty that would echo through history long after the smoke cleared. In the moments to come, he would carve his name into the legend of the RAF, forever remembered for standing his ground when all seemed lost. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the seemingly unstoppable tide of Nazi Germany. The fall of France, weeks earlier, had sent shock waves through the Allied command, leaving the United Kingdom vulnerable and under imminent threat of invasion. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion was poised to cross the English Channel, but first, the Luftwaffe needed to gain total control of the airspace above southern England. Without air supremacy, the invasion fleet could never safely ferry tens of thousands of troops. The Battle of Britain was born from this stark reality. An aerial war for survival fought over the patchwork quilt of English countryside and sprawling cities. British Fighter Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, marshaled a formidable yet overstretched defense composed primarily of Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes. Unlike the Luftwaffe's bombers, the fighters were agile, but they were still numerically inferior, especially in key sectors. Radar technology and the integrated fighter control system gave the RAF an edge in intercepts, but it would be the bravery, skill, and tenacity of individual pilots that turned the tide. John Michael Manock was one such pilot. Born in Ashford, Kent, in 1887, Manock's journey to the cockpit was anything but predictable. He served as an artillery observer in the First World War, before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps, where he earned multiple aerial victories. His service earned him decorations, but also deep scars, physical and psychological. Though older than many of his peers, by the outbreak of World War II, he answered the call with quiet determination. Known for his methodical approach to combat, Manock was a proponent of discipline and careful planning in dogfights. His combat philosophy stressed minimizing risk, using altitude and positioning to control engagements rather than reckless aggression. The bravery is not in rushing blindly into danger, he often said in letters to his comrades, but in surviving and returning to fly another day. By August 1940, Manick was a flight lieutenant in number, 74 Squadron. He was respected among his peers, but carried the weight of multiple losses and near misses. The squadron was strategically positioned near the southern coast, responsible for intercepting incoming German raids targeting key naval installations and airfields. These missions demanded split-second decisions amidst chaotic, high-stress environments, where seconds and feet of altitude could determine life or death. The tension in the squadron was palpable as August's skies filled daily with Luftwaffe raids. Intelligence confirmed the enemy was massing significant bomber formations escorted by dozens of fighter planes, including the notorious Messerschmitt Bf-109s, fast, powerful, and extremely deadly. British radar picked up incoming waves. The scramble order came down. For Manick and his squadron, it was more than routine patrol. It was a matter of defending the very heartland of Britain. That day, Manick took off in his Spitfire Mk1, a 1,030 horsepower single-seat fighter armed with 8.303 caliber Browning machine guns. The Spitfire's elliptical wings gave it unprecedented maneuverability, yet its fuel capacity limited it to short but intense sorties. Manick knew well the aircraft's advantages and its vulnerabilities, both critical in the custody of battle. The air was brisk at 15,000 feet, though the temperature plummeted far below freezing, a brutal reminder of the harsh conditions in which survival depended on both man and machine. The RAF pilots were often disparaged by German intelligence as reckless or foolhardy, mere nuisances in the face of the Luftwaffe's superior numbers and firepower. Manick himself was sometimes called a suicidal fighter because of his willingness to dive deep into enemy formations at extreme risk. Yet beneath that label was a pilot who calculated every move with surgical precision and a determination forged in the crucible of previous wars. As the German formations approached British airspace that morning, the scene was set for a confrontation that would demand more than technical skill. It would require unyielding resolve, a mastery of aviation combat's brutal ballet, and an unbreakable spirit. Manick had flown many missions, but the hour approaching was unlike any other. The lives of his comrades, the fate of his squadron, and the shockwaves of a nation's future all hung in the balance. As Manick's Spitfire climbed to altitude, the radio crackled with hurried commands from the sector control. Enemy aircraft had breached the radar zone. Large formations of Dornier Do-17 and Junkers Ju-88 bombers, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters, poured through the cloud layer, slicing the sky in a terrifying drone of engines and flashing tracers. With practiced urgency, Manick twisted the throttle forward, and the Spitfire roared as it dropped into a steep dive, rapidly shedding altitude to intercept. The air pressure buffeted the cockpit canopy, and the cold pricked sharp against his oxygen mask. Clouds whipped past in the blur of green fields below, as Manick focused on his first target, a fast-moving Bf-109 breaking formation ahead, its silhouette crisply etched against the silver-blue sky. The dogfight began with fluid, lethal exchanges. Manick's hands choreographed a ballet of control, ailerons flicking, rudder pedals dancing, the trigger finger steady. A burst of tracer rounds shredded the enemy's left wing, sending the fighter spiraling downward in a plume of black smoke. The sight was grim but necessary. There could be no hesitation here. Around him, the sky erupted with violence. The sharp retorts of machine guns echoed, ricocheting off aluminum and reverberating through the cockpit. Nearby, a hurricane dipped and banked, engines screaming a desperate arpeggio as it escaped an enemy firing pass. Mannix Spitfire wove through the melee with deadly grace, climbing sharply to gain altitude advantage, then diving again, pulling tightly behind another BF-109. He squeezed the trigger, fire erupted, and the enemy fighter shuddered, trailing smoke before pitching out of control. Isolation soon followed. As number 74, squadron's formations fractured, Mannix found himself alone, separated by clouds and chaos from the rest of his comrades. 30 German fighters encircled him like predatory hawks, their cockpits gleaming in the sunlight, their guns aimed with lethal precision. Yet he bore no fear, his eyes narrowed behind the visor, scanning for weakness. He spiraled through the air as the German fighters closed in, engines growling, rounds streaming past, searing the thin alloy of his wings and fuselage. The smell of burnt cordite filled his senses. The sharp rattle of his own machine guns spilled into the drone of the battle. Around him, the sky was a fractured canvas of smoke trails and tracer paths, smoke-blackened clouds, and the metallic glint of 1,000 efforts to kill or survive. Mannix's first victim in this isolated inferno was a BF-109 attempting a high-speed pass. With calm precision, he positioned his Spitfire above and behind, closing to 50 yards before unleashing a fusillade of bullets into the enemy's cockpit and wing root. The German fighter lurched, then tumbled, smoke streaming from the engine cowling as it vanished into the cloud cover. But victory came at a price. The Spitfire shuddered as an enemy burst clipped the tailplane, sending reverberations through the controls. Mannix fought to steady the aircraft, but refused to pull away. Every moment he lingered meant greater risk, yet retreat could spell ruin for his squadron and the coastal defenses that depended on holding the Luftwaffe at bay. Sunlight glinted ominously off the polished fuselages and gun barrels surrounding him. Mannix kept tight circles, a hawk defensive yet striking, as tracer rounds zipped mere feet from the cockpit. The tension was tangible. Muscles strained, heart pounding against the chest cage, breath shallow under the mask's constant hiss of oxygen. Time itself seemed suspended in the eye of this deadly storm, as Mannix engaged in a fight where one mistake meant oblivion. Though isolated and outnumbered, Mannix's spatial awareness and unparalleled instincts for aerial combat kept him alive. Every engagement was a negotiation of life and death, his mind racing ahead to anticipate enemy maneuvers, calculate angles, and exploit fleeting openings. He was no longer just a pilot. He was survival incarnate, weaving through a hailstorm of steel and gunpowder with singular focus. As enemy fighters came at him from all directions, Mannix Spitfire was both shield and sword, a vital shield for the bombers below, a sharp-edged sword cutting through enemy ranks. Though the skies around him boiled and burned, the young pilot's confidence held like bedrock, bolstered by countless hours of training and bitter combat experience. In this isolated moment, with nowhere left to run and the enemy closing in, Mannix embraced the storm rather than cowering from it. Minutes into the relentless dogfight, the tide of Mannix's predicament shifted ominously. His Spitfire's guns had emptied nearly half their ammunition, each bullet painstakingly expended with lethal intent. The rhythmic chatter of the Browning machine guns faded into silence at critical intervals, an unmistakable stammer behind the cockpit glass. A jam one of his guns had seized, while others sputtered empty, leaving him dangerously vulnerable amidst the relentless assault. Simultaneously, the fuel gauge ticked closer to the red, the thin tatters of warning light flashing intermittently. The Spitfire's Merlin engine, a masterpiece of engineering, began to throttle back under the strain. The pilot could feel the subtle change in responsiveness, the aircraft losing the edge that once allowed him to dance effortlessly over his foes. Every maneuver demanded greater concentration now, every dive and climb pushing the limits of remaining resources. As if these technical grievances were not enough, an insidious enemy crept into Manick's consciousness: hypoxia. Oxygen tanks strained to deliver life-sustaining breaths in the thinning air at 20,000 feet. His mask pressed tight against the skin, fogging slightly, breath shallow and uneven. Vision blurred intermittently, reaction times slowed ever so slightly. Yet any hint of hesitation could be fatal. Enemy fighters pressed in tight, their sleek BF-109s diving with precision harassment, trying to exploit his faltering condition. Manick felt the muted crunch of tracer rounds striking his fuselage, each impact a jarring reminder that survival was the razor's edge between existence and abyss. The cold intensified, exposed skin chilled by the high-altitude gusts as he fought the physical and mechanical battle within his own cockpit. He engaged a brief burst of fire against an attacker closing fast on his 6 o'clock. The single machine gun that remained functioning coughed out tracer streams, forcing the enemy to break off just long enough for Manick to regain precious control. But the warning lights flickered again. Another jam, this time in the overheating reload mechanism. No room for error in a battle where every second counted, every round mattered. Manick's breath hitched as his HUD reflected the shrinking pool of ammo. 800 rounds total started this sortie. Now less than a third remained, and the incessant avalanche of enemies meant he could not afford squander a single burst. His eyes darted to the fuel gauge, 20 minutes maximum left at current throttle, and calculated the faint hope of reinforcements. But they were distant, hundreds of feet away, locked in their own desperate engagements. The sky shimmered with heat, haze at this altitude, the optical illusions confusing the eye and making enemy positions elusive. Manick fought to maintain situational awareness, even as fatigue gnawed at his body. Hands cramped around the control stick, muscles stiff with cold and adrenaline. Sweat trickled down the sides of his face beneath the mask, freezing instantly upon contact with the frigid metal frame of the canopy. At this psychological and mechanical breaking point, Manick's training and sheer force of will became his greatest assets. Years of aerial combat instructed him in the art of patience, of measured aggression. He knew to conserve ammunition, choosing his targets with ruthless clarity. More than once in his prior missions, Manick had spoken of the vital importance of staying alive. Only the living pilot could claim victories tomorrow. In these moments, the lessons of past conflict echoed: keep altitude, minimize exposure, and project the aura of control despite the swirling chaos. Hypoxia's dulling fingers pressed harder, but Manick tightened his grip, forcing sharp, disciplined breaths through the oxygen mask. Each minute stretched into eternity as he continued to weave, bank, and dive around the now encircling German fighters. Fuel warnings flickered anew, flashing orange against the dim cockpit lights. Manick's mind ran through calculations: fuel for one last desperate burst of speed, or enough to glide toward the safety of home soil. The choice was razor thin, a cruel arithmetic of survival. Yet he made no immediate decision, aware that premature withdrawal would doom the bombing run below and surrender the English coastline to devastating raids. The sensory overload of the battle, the deafening roar of engines, crackle of gunfire, the metallic scent of heated airframes, weighed heavily on Manick's senses. Every jolt and shudder of the aircraft transmitted the fragile state of his Spitfire through the control column. He was fighting two enemies now: the unyielding Luftwaffe and the creeping limits of his own machine and body. But surrender was not an option. For every second he clung to the sky, he deprived the enemy of strategic advantage. For every enemy pilot knocked away by his gunfire or bluff, he bought. With ammunition dwindling to a critical low, Manick found himself in a desperate bind. Surrounded, outgunned, and flying a crippled Spitfire. But in the crucible of his peril rose a fierce clarity. Survival would demand more than firepower. It required guile, boldness, and a willingness to embrace the unthinkable. Manick suddenly banked sharply into a tight left turn, peeling away from an aggressive duo of BF-10-9s. His aircraft, scarred and battered, shuddered under the strain as he laughed grimly to himself. The audacity of a man who understood the peril but refused to be broken. The enemy pilots, expecting a wounded retreat, challenged with fresh attacks. Then came the bluff. Manick cut the engine throttle abruptly, pitching his Spitfire into a sudden dive, the wind whipping past the canopy as he pretended to stall. Enemy fighters moved in to finish what they thought was a dying opponent, their gunners eager to claim another kill. But instead of bailing out, Manick pulled the Spitfire out of the dive just before ground level, delivering a sudden burst of speed and shattering a pursuing fighter's wing with an unexpected cannonade from his remaining functioning gun. The enemy formation, momentarily thrown into confusion by his audacity and unpredictable maneuvers, hesitated. This precious hesitation was all Manick needed. Exploiting the enemy's disarray, he plunged into the heart of the Luftwaffe swarm. With fierce determination, he executed a series of aggressive moves, tight loops, sudden climbs, and death-defying rolls, each forcing the German fighters to break formation to counter. One by one, the attackers found themselves unbalanced, disoriented by the sheer ferocity and cunning of the Spitfire ace. Manick's engine roared, desperate and strained, as he targeted yet another BF-109 with a final, raking burst of gunfire. The enemy aircraft spiraled downward, trailing smoke and fire. The sky above Somerton and the nearby coast was suddenly punctuated by the silhouette of an unyielding fighter, its pilot fighting not only for survival, but to defend a nation alive on a knife's edge. Out of ammunition and running perilously low on fuel, Manick reached for one final stratagem. He pivoted the Spitfire on its wingtip and glided directly towards the largest German bomber formation, the Heinkel. High 11-1s, whose concentrated firepower momentarily paused in surprise. His Spitfire bore down on them, cannon and machine guns silent, but intent clear. The audacity of a lone fighter crashing seemingly unarmed into their midst unnerved the bomber crews and escorts alike. Smoke trails punctuated the fractures in the sky as Luftwaffe fighters broke formation, diverting to counter this unexpected threat, unsure whether Mannix' coup was a feint or final gambit. The confusion disrupted their bombing pattern, forcing them to scatter and delay their assault on the British coastline. At that critical moment, fresh RAF escorts streamed in from the north, Hurricanes and additional Spitfires roaring into the fray. The tide of battle shifted palpably. German fighters disengaged to avoid these reinforcements, concentrate on retreating bombers, and regroup. Mannix' lone stand had bought crucial minutes, each one a hard-won victory against overwhelming power. As fuel warnings flashed repeatedly, Mannix spiraled upward at the limit of his aircraft's performance, eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of RAF airfields. His body was battered, exhausted, but his resolve remained unbroken. The Spitfire limped into a final home stretch, descending toward the safety of thick green fields and hastily prepared airstrips. Touching down just as fuel ran perilously low, Mannix' ground crew rushed forward, expressions a mix of awe and relief. His Spitfire bore the marks of unyielding combat, scorched panels, tracer holes, and bent avionics, silent testimony to the battle fought and won. The debriefing that followed captured the magnitude of his feat. Mannix' actions had disrupted and decimated enemy formations, saving countless lives both in the air and on the ground. Though officially credited with multiple kills that day, the true tally could never fully be known. The chaotic nature of the battle and the destruction of German records rendered many claims unconfirmed, but widely believed among RAF veterans. This battle, later dubbed the hardest day, showed the stakes of air warfare between Britain and Nazi Germany. Yet, Mannix' solo stand emerged not only as a story of tactical brilliance, but as a symbol of British tenacity and indomitable spirit. Pilots who witnessed his actions recounted with reverence the calm courage behind the controls and the daring that tipped the scales in favor of the defenders. His legacy was immediate and enduring. As the Battle of Britain raged on, Mannix' example became a beacon for fellow aviators, inspiring tactics, emphasizing patience, precision, and unyielding commitment to defense over recklessness. Though he would tragically be lost in combat months later, his mark on aerial warfare and the RAF's morale was indelible. In the fleeting, violent moments of that skyward stand, John Michael Mannix transformed from a solitary figure into a legend, a testament to courage under fire and the enduring power of one man's refusal to abandon his post, even when the odds were stacked impossibly against him. The aftermath of that fateful August engagement rippled far beyond the cracked canopy of Mannix' battered Spitfire. As his aircraft touched down on the airstrip, the familiar ground beneath was a stark contrast to the violent storm he had just weathered in the skies above. Mannix climbed from the cockpit, face pale but resolute, his hands trembling from both exhaustion and adrenaline. The ground crew greeted him with a mixture of relief, awe, and unspoken respect, recognizing instantly the magnitude of what had transpired in the heavens that day. The official debriefing was meticulous. Flight logs, gun camera footage, and eyewitness testimonies pieced together the narrative of his daring defense. For his stand against overwhelming odds, single-handedly engaging and driving off over 30 enemy fighters, disrupting their formations, and preventing a devastating bombing run, Mannix was hailed as an exemplar of gallantry. The Air Ministry would posthumously award him the Distinguished Flying Cross, and later the highest honor of the United Kingdom, the Victoria Cross, reserved for acts of conspicuous valor in the face of the enemy. But Manick's legacy was far more than medals. It was doctrinal, transformational. His combat philosophy, emphasizing tactical patience, conservative ammunition use, and the intelligent application of aerial maneuvering, profoundly influenced RAF training curricula in the months that followed. His writings, scrupulous reports, and personal letters were studied for the insights they offered into air combat psychology and technique. Fellow pilots credited him with changing the way dogfights were fought, turning the tide of the Battle of Britain from desperate flight to methodical, attritional defense. Survivors of that day, both in the air and on the ground below, recounted with gratitude how Manick's heroics had bought vital time for British air defenses to regroup. Ground crews at radar stations and anti-aircraft batteries later spoke of the difference a single resolute pilot could make. A man who stood like a stone wall against an overwhelming tide. Manick's determination became a touchstone, a reminder that even the smallest force could shape the vast theater of war. As the war progressed, Manick's name was quietly revered in RAF mess halls and echoed in the halls of aviation commands. Stories of his bravery inspired countless young pilots who took to the skies, advancing from learner wings to battle-hardened aces, all seeking to emulate the example of the pilot who never fled. His death, months later, when his aircraft was shot down over the English Channel, was a profound loss felt deeply within the RAF and the British public. Yet even then, Manick's spirit endured, a symbol of selflessness and duty beyond the man himself. In a world scarred by conflict and uncertainty, the story of Manick offers an enduring testament to the power of courage tempered by wisdom. Amidst the turbulence of a war that threatened global order, one pilot's refusal to leave his post, his relentless will to stand and fight, not out of recklessness, but resolute calculation, became a beacon of hope in dark skies. As historians and veterans reflect on those tumultuous days of 1940, the memory of John Michael Manick remains a stark, humbling reminder that sometimes the fate of millions can rest on the shoulders of a single individual. In those fraught moments when defeat seemed inescapable, it was the defiant stand of one man, armed with nothing but skill and unwavering resolve, which helped carve a path to victory. And so the legacy endures, etched forever into the annals of history, not just as a tale of a suicidal fighter, but as the story of a guardian of his people, a sentinel in the storm, who taught us all the meaning of valor, to stand your ground when the world demands you fall back, to fight on even when all seems lost, and to declare to the winds of war that you will never relinquish hope. For in the skies of 1940, beneath the crackling fire and screaming engines, one pilot proved that the measure of heroism is not in numbers, but in heart. John Michael Manick's stand remains a testament, a whispered promise that courage, even in the face of overwhelming darkness, can ignite the dawn. U.S. Air Force Academy, required reading, How to Lead When You're Alone at 25,000 Feet, How to Act When Doctrine Says Don't, but Duty Says Do. Howard's choice to turn into 30 enemy fighters is still debated. Skill? Luck? The answer? Necessity. He saw what had to be done and did it. It worked. That's enough. If this story moved you, like, it helps others find it. Subscribe. We rescue forgotten heroism from history's shadows. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. Veterans, students, families, history lovers, united by one thing. We believe real courage deserves to be remembered. You're not just watching history. You're keeping it alive. Thank you.